the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Well, Lord Jesus, we all live in an uncertain world, and we will often be beset with many fears and apprehensions, but we know that comes not from you, but from the evil one. So we just ask in a special way that you just calm our hearts, that you just bring us your peace, let us shut off the worries of the day, just give us some respite, and always let us know that even though life may be difficult for some of us, maybe harder for some than others, that you're always with us. That you never promised us the smooth, happy life, but that you always promised you'd be with us forever, and in all things you would draw us to yourself. So we just ask you to to continue what you have begun with us, finish in us the good work, and we ask you to bless us this evening in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. All right, so the last session here. Excuse me. We'll start out talking a little bit about human sexuality, and in light of divine revelation and philosophical anthropology. And then we'll wrap up by talking about artificial reproduction technology, contraception, sterilizations, and such. So I'll read a little bit just through your outline, and then start commenting from there. It starts out here, God created man and woman in his own image and likeness. Bless you. Equal in dignity, united in marriage with natural sexual differences and a strong mutual attraction. So we have to have a proper understanding of our human nature in order to understand and uphold the dignity of the human person. So the 6th and 9th commandments we'll be looking at, I guess, such tonight. The theology of the body. The intimate union of married man and woman reflects the community of divine persons that is blessing. And I always think it's good to start out with something like this, that's really what we're being concerned with. What is it that marriage itself reflects? You know, I think of the temptation of Christ in the desert. Satan says to him, I'll turn these stones into bread. And, you know, we think of bread in the desert. I know myself, I'm not trying to give an exposition on this, but when I reflected on this, I immediately thought, we were looking hard, this is a very significant thing. It's God who has given the bread from heaven. And right away, he's almost tempting him, you do it. Don't trust your father. It's something I get out of it. Then he brings him on the pinnacle and says, certainly, you know, the angels will not allow you to fall. Throw yourself off of here. And this idea that somehow God is the physical protector of us, that we're going to gauge our relation with him with how well we stay healthy and we don't get hurt and such. Just another way that we get tempted. These are like just reflections that I try to think out in my own life. You know, none of these temptations are still happening with us. And then, of course, it says, bow down and worship me, and all this will be yours. Well, the lure of material wealth, even for, you know, some of us that are they're used to living a little bit leaner than some. It's still there. Just because you want to live simple doesn't mean that you don't want these things. Well, what I take from this, and the reason why I put it in now, is that's Satan trying to get within the Trinity. He's trying to break it up. If I can just, you know, somehow divide the divine persons from each other, well, he couldn't do it. Christ each time retorted with a scripture, and then Satan left. So, what will he attack? He will attack man and woman. What image is the Trinity? In other words, we don't have any fuller sign here than the love of man and woman. And it's not just the sexual love, we know that. So he's going to have to go after the sign if he couldn't get to the real thing. Just something that I think through. So what we see is, if he can break what marriage points to, what the nuptial understanding of the human people point to, then perhaps, you know, moving the sign so people can't get to the location would be a nice tactic. I think that's where he's going with this. He wants us to not trust God for all we need, to not believe that God exists unless he keeps us free from suffering, and that the things of this world are greater. So anyway, just something to think about as we go through here, because I oftentimes, young people and even the engaged couples who are being taught next door here, this is usually the class section that I teach with them, you know, what's the sense of this? You know, what's at stake? I think this is what's at stake, our understanding of the Trinity. So it talks about the virtue of chastity, a moral virtue that empowers a person to have a loving relationship with God and to see Christ in every human person. To see us as complete human persons rather than objects. So the Catechism describes it as a successful integration of sexuality within the person and the inner unity of man and his bodily and spiritual being. So in short, it's properly ordered love, depending on our particular vocation or station in life. And how much better this is. I mean, if, like me growing up, we were just taught abstinence. Well, they didn't really say abstinence, they just said don't have sex. That was about it. I literally remember the sex talk that I had in grade school. Sister took all of the boys down to this end of the hallway, and another sister took all the girls down the end of the hallway, and we saw that sister kind of talking lovingly to the girls, and I could tell you the extent of my sex education was, do you see those girls down there? You will never objectify them. You will never use them as objects. It was it's probably needed, right? It was a stern talk. But the problem with this, not that there's anything necessarily wrong with abstinence, as we know, but how does that translate then into your other vocations, marriage, the religious life? I mean, how do you go from just simply not having sex to, in the married life, having sex? Oh, now it's good, So there's no real idea of how that moves. So with chastity, once we understand the properly ordered love, it's a smooth transition, no matter what vocation we might have in life, whatever our station is in life. So it's a much better way, I think, to teach it. It talks about chastity being the worship of God in your body, the work of the Holy Spirit. I like this. This chastity is a stance before the other person. I see him as a good. I desire what's good for him. And then it talks about a Christian vision of human sexuality. And of course for the unmarried, and also for the person that's in the vocation of marriage. I'm thinking of the young engaged couples next door, not all young, but the engaged couples next door, how radical that is in today's world. I mean, many people do not choose marriage. And sometimes we don't think that it's a radical move, but we're at the point now, at least in our world, where we're going to start standing out. It's going to be a little easier to stand out. They don't see it as an institution. They don't understand this, that it's a structure to help protect something quite sacred. Even young people might share their sexual experiences and feel betrayed, feel used, not quite understanding that there isn't, and I don't want to just call it an institution. There's so much more. There's a filial relationship that's meant to protect those things. So there's so much more that's in that we get in marriage. But nonetheless, the image is being diminished, and I do think it's Satan trying to be on the offensive against the Trinity. Another thing, and this is going to be really just my opinion on this, is that I see, and I think you probably agree, that we're having a difficult time understanding the distinctions between male and female. Are we just talking about traditional roles where the woman stayed home and the husband worked? We get caught up in these things, not realizing that it has to go beyond biology. I love reading psychological studies and such, but I don't like introducing them here so much, because a lot of times, at least in how I would do them, they're anecdotal, but there has to be some distinction. I had a young girl come to me some years ago, and I'm sorry right now, I can't remember the more proper name for an androgynous young person. Do you know what that is, Laura? I can't think of it. Transgender. No, not the people who are transgender, but a person who we would tend to think, not unisex, but they were born androgynous, and they had basically their sex had to be selected from them at a young age. There's a different name for it now, and every time I go to use it, it loses me. Well, she was quite concerned when we started, and I don't go over a list or anything with the students, but what is it? I mean, what does the church teach about this? I said, well, it's not that the church teaches anything particular about that as you're saying it. This person has the full dignity of every other human being. This is not, because the child might have been born either with, underdeveloped genitalia or a more androgynous state. Well, yeah, well, okay, that's hermaphrodite, I'm sorry. That's what I would have called it, but that's not a term that they prefer today. And I can't think of the term, but you're right, at least you got me on the right track, thank you. And I said, but, can I ask you something? And she was quite sincere. I said, don't you think there's an issue with your identity that gets confused in that a lot? Like, in other words, people might say, well, look, what exactly is the difference? Are we just talking simply chromosomes? What do we do when there's issues with that? Are we just talking, genitalia? What do we do when there's issues with that? What do we do with these hard cases? And my experience has been that these hard cases often point to maybe just how central this sexuality is. When we use the word sexuality, we're talking male-female, not gender. That's more used for pronouns or masculinity and femininity. And so, yeah, they're hard cases, but it doesn't at least point to that. So I remember one philosophical anthropology class I had with a professor I had, Dr. Rhonda Chervin, and we worked out, what we may think are certain characteristics of male and female, and I'll share them with you, and we can talk about them, and hopefully it's not. I think we all know there's a difference between a stereotype and a generalization. A generalization is what you might find typically in a population. A stereotype is because you belong to that population, then of course you must hold all those generalizations. That's not true. But this is just my own reflection, and I think too they're not so lined up in columns. You could probably find yourself going back and forth. My professor, Dr. Rhonda Chervin, she was actually born an atheist and then raised a Jew and then converted into Catholicism and did her PhD work at Fordham. And she jokingly sent back to me saying, unfortunately, I identify more with your male characteristics than I do female. Perhaps that's it. But my wife, who is a strong woman, considers herself a feminist, but this kind of fits for us. So it's anecdotal, but nonetheless. I find the female is much more personal and relational oriented. I don't know that the male that comes as easy for a male. We're more practical. I think a woman is more relational and nurturing. I think a male is more individual. And I'll give you a small anecdote with this. I think a female looks more for her identity in relationships and a male more for his identity in vocations. And again, that may change. A female, and I think this is one of the more important ones, a female is very immanent. She's in the time and place where she's at. A male is much more transcendent. I'm usually over here, somewhere. A woman, this is obviously, fertility is quite bodily. For a male, his fertility is outside of the body. That's not going to be an easy distinction to overcome, especially when we talk about things like contraception and such. Females, stimulated by touch. Male, stimulated by sight. Females are very good at multi-level relationships. Males, one-dimensional. I think a female is very intuitive in a relationship, and a male is very skill-oriented. This isn't supposed to say anything, grand. Excuse me. We're teaching classes in here. That would have went on for the next half hour. See, I really resisted my Italian side, just opening the door going, hey, what is that type of thing. I was with a friend, cousin through marriage. Me, him, and his mother and his stepfather were in the hospice. His stepfather was passing away of cancer. And it was just the four of us. How me and my cousin got talking about this is beyond me. It's beyond me. And he said, well, I just think you're just bringing up a lot of stereotypes. And we went back and forth probably for about 15 minutes. And then all of a sudden I realized, I looked over and I thought, here we are at the foot of the bed of a dying man. He died that next morning, discussing this. And the woman in the room was at his side constantly just holding his hand. I said, that can't just, that has to mean something. I think where we get into problems is that, we start to see one of these is so inferior to the other. In my view, the female wins in this. I really do. I think it's much more beautiful in how it plays out. Another psychological study I read, they took 1-year-olds and put them, male and female, behind like a gate, like a child's gate, and then removed the mother from the room. The male children managed to knock the gate down. The women children stayed behind, the young girls behind the gate, and cried. Now you may perceive superficially that just looks like weakness, but I think it has much more to do with the relationality and the nurturing aspects of them. Now we might say that some of this is just because of our culture, and perhaps part of it is influenced by that, but maybe not so much so with that. Now I'm not trying to make any grand statement out of this. It's just that there has to be some distinction. In other words, if in Genesis we understand that Christ made us in his image, he made us in our own likeness, he made us so we have dominion over the earth, male and female, he created us, that there has to be some meaning to that. So I'm not quite sure, what do you think of my list? Anything to add, or? Does it seem unreasonable?
I think it crosses over, though. I think.
Yeah, I think you're right, sister.
Yeah, there's a, and that's the issue today when we see gay and lesbian folks. Some of those characteristics are very prevalent in the male, who has a very feminine nature in the gay male. So, but we're only seeing it now more and more because they're coming out. I mean, they're coming out, so we're observant of that. I was listening to NPR and that down at the Children's, this blew my mind, but I'm really glad to hear it's happening. Down in Children's Hospital, they developed there's a clinic for children that are having gender issues, and they're bringing them in, and because parents don't know how to deal when the kids are showing opposite genders, and they had a 5-year-old that came. The parents brought the child in because they just didn't know how to cope with it. The child was saying, I guess the child, I don't know if it was male or female, I forget, but was having other feelings within their body at 5 years old, and is expressing it. I feel very different in my body. Something's is different inside of me. So, and they're panicking because, trying to differentiate the sex of the child. And what do we do? And these two that are working in this clinic with children and adolescents that are going through this, say to the parents, you first say, I love you. And second of all, you talk to me about how you're feeling on the inside, what is going on. You keep talking and talking with me. And you go through their life, and in some cases, they are, they're gay or they're lesbian, and they're going to develop that way. They said what they've noticed is when parents try to, because they panic, they don't know. Culturally, we're just learning how to deal with this as it presents to our family structure. And what parents do, they begin to not listen to them, nonverbal behaviors, say a whole lot. And then what happens is later on, they say, those children do go into mental health issues, and they do have problems later on. But if they're able to work, the parents are listening constantly, saying, I love you, exploring what they're going through, they then own if they're going to be gay or lesbian. So this is something that's been going on for centuries, and we're just learning the chemistry that is different in some of us.
Well, we started out this course by talking about the fact that we're incarnate beings. Mm-hmm. So there's quite a bit that involves this. We didn't get into talking about epigenetics or genetics. All of it's very interesting, but we're affected on many different levels. But I think the point I'm trying to make is that there has to be some distinction. We know this from divine revelation. We even know this from genetics. I mean, there's some distinction that's there, and it's going to play into somewhat how we talk about human sexuality today. Again, I wish I would have gotten the names of some of these, but I saw, I don't know the women's fashion magazines, so I'm reading an article about the article. I guess how that's pretty bad, right? But they were talking about how the ideal model and how that has changed over the years, and that we tend to be in a period where, and this is the words of this woman, I wish I'd have had her name, that we are now emulating the figure of an adolescent boy. In our models, this is the figure. So she's, without trying to make too much of it, she's saying, what does this mean for us as a society? Are we starting to lose the distinctions between the two in our understandings of it and such? It's something we have to consider. We won't obviously settle anything about that this evening. But so at this point, I just wanted to start talking a little bit about, as your unit here says, about the language of the body. It's typically known as theology of the body. I like the term nuptial mystery. myself, John Paul II would call it the human love and the divine plan. And I think, you know, we didn't talk directly about humanae vitae and the connections between the unitive and the procreative aspects of the human person. There's been some critique, sometimes it's overplayed, that the church has really just most recently picked up the unitive aspect of the human person. Well, you know, yes and no. There has been an emphasis in the past on the procreative aspects. But it doesn't mean that our understanding of the unitive dimensions of marriage and the scriptures on love and marriage were absent. There's been different emphasis throughout the years, but that could be for various reasons. There's always some development that goes on. But another thing, and I think the danger is that people will sometimes take what John Paul II, are we somewhat familiar with the theology of the body? Have you heard this before? Okay, they'll take it as, you know, that it's so new, it's so innovative, as though the church has not understood human sexuality for 2,000 years, and we just figured this out. That's not really the case. Even a lot of, you know, what he has come up with, you know, you may not have been, well, he doesn't even say it's a tolerance, he doesn't try to own it in that way. There's a lot of philosophers from the early 20th century, von Hildebrand particularly, that has worked through this. So what's the difference? Well, you know, when you have, before the medieval period, obviously Augustine was a strong influence in the Platonic understanding of the human person. Then, you know, with the advent of Aquinas, we start the Thomistic metaphysics, such comes into play. But something happened, I would say, at least in modern, you know, in historical terms, modern, we're talking, you know, 17th century, all right? A change. The worldview was different. What once was, you know, very objective and very deductive, that's not really the case anymore. We live more in a world where truths are subjective, where we're much more experiential, and things are more inductive. You know, we want empirically based things. So there needed to be some level of expression. And, you know, nobody sits down, we don't have a map exactly where we are on the road. So at some point, I think, you know, the Spirit works through people and starts to say, here's where we are and here's where we're going. So they introduced, or not introduced, I shouldn't say it that way, but John Paul II picked up on what's known as phenomenology. Now, phenomenology looks at the things a little bit different than the medieval metaphysics, rather than simply to look at something and determine what it is in itself, like what is the essence of that thing, of the toaster, of the soda, or, you know, if that's a human person. Phenomenology is much more experiential. So, you know, you might see a building, but we never see all four sides of the building and the roof. We only see our profile. You might see a chair, but typically you might only see 3 legs of the chair. But the way that those things and the experiences that might match with those present themselves to us, we don't just experience that profile, we experience the whole thing. So, in essence, phenomenology is how something presents itself to our conscience. So here we're able to really use, you know, something very experiential, but yet it can be based on something quite objective. It doesn't have to simply be subjective values. Now, that's very confusing, usually when you just say it that way. Phenomenology, even within it, there's an argument as to whether or not it is a own philosophy or whether it's just a movement that goes on. And then whose type of phenomenology. So there's a lot that could be said about it. It's not that important for taking care of it tonight. But it affects our ethics, and it affects the way that we look at things. So John Paul II was quite influenced by the philosophers that have that introduced this. And I know myself, it was quite interesting to go back and read through this. So the way I understand it, he wanted to write a book when he became Pope, but at the time, popes didn't write books. I mean, there was this unwritten rule, so he said, I'll put it out in his Wednesday catechesis. So every Wednesday over the course of 4 years, you know, give or take, he would present these 15-minute segments, and then they were collected into the book, The Human Love and the Divine Plan. Sometimes just to read them through, they could be very redundant, because you can imagine, you're always saying, okay, last week I was talking about this, and then you say what you want to say, and then you lead in your next week, and then the next week I talked about this. So, you know, they can be very, very difficult to try to get through. Plus, and here's what I think is sort of important, is one class that I took on this, specifically on theology of the body in grad school, there must have been 22 seminarians, probably 3 religious sisters, 2 religious brothers, and 3 of us lay persons. And at the end of the class, we were asked, what do you think is the greatest challenge to disseminating this in the parishes and the schools and such? And unrehearsed, almost in unison, everybody said the sheer density of it. It is that dense. And now, I think because theologically, Benedict XVI was probably one of the greater theologians that sat in that position for many, many centuries. And I'm not a papal historian, but I'm not quite sure the last time we had a philosopher like John Paul II in there. So he brought quite a bit of information to bear. And as you are well aware, theology of the body has become a cottage industry for some. It's, you know, people make livings off of something. I don't know if there's anything wrong with that per se. But what happens is that popularizes it, which is good, right? Because it gets the word out. It's a type of evangelization. But then people hear the popular presentation and sometimes repeat it, and you're then missing the beauty the sublimity behind it. And sometimes even the reverence that should be following it. So I touch on this when I teach the kids. I don't present it as theology of the body, I just present it as nuptial mystery and the understanding of the human person and love. And we go from there. But nonetheless, I'll talk a little bit about it tonight, just so we can, I guess, slightly go over it and say we did. Okay, so he begins basically, he basically begins by talking, when Jesus talking about whether or not they're questioning, you know, can a woman get divorced? Well, Moses, yes, he said they could, but you know, that was only because of your stubbornness of heart. And then it's like a technique for him to get back into Scripture and say, but in the beginning it was not so. Now, I think this is, you know, I'd rather not just like go slavishly through theology of the body. Just, you know, I'll give you like my experience when I think is some of the good points on this. You know, this is kind of important. So you have we have 2 Genesis stories, right? We have the Genesis story, which they typically call the priestly story. This is the Genesis 1. And then Genesis 2:4 begins what is typically known as the Yahweh story. It's much more anthropological, right? You have Jesus being down and dirty, forming things in the ground. The first one's quite orderly. Well, the first one we can almost understand that there's quite objective relations going on. And then we see real subjectivity and sometimes you have to be careful too, because I'm not using subjectivity as in, well, that's only true subjectively for you. It's the person, subjective to the person. So, you know, when you think of what's going on in the second Genesis story, it's quite remarkable, you know, that you have Jesus in an intimate relationship with his creation. It's kind of beautiful if you think about it. He's walking and talking with them in the garden. And I know just spiritually, what a nice reflection to have. But nonetheless, you know, John Paul II would have called this original solitude that he has with God, this uniqueness. So we would even, you know, extrapolate from that even as we talk about people who would struggle with their own sexuality, it's not the primary way that we identify ourselves. That's important. We're not saying it's not integral to the human person, but it's not the primary way we identify ourselves. We're made in his image. And everybody, regardless of how we lay out on with our own sexuality, that's who we are. And then, you know, so you have this real innocence time here, right? So what Christ recognized, and we could talk about the relationality of the human person, that this man should not be alone. So he then has the man, all the animals are brought before him. And he names and he names and he names them. And none of these suit. So God recognizes that, you know. So there's all these things that, you know, if you want to talk about phenomenology and how a person's experience is presented to your conscience, you can imagine how this plays out for Adam here. Here's this man, he understands his own corporality, he's in this world, his solitude with God, his relationship to all other creation, he knows himself to be distinct from that, and is somehow a custodian of it, so quite relation to it, but in a beautiful, natural understanding of himself. So it says that God basically puts the man to sleep. And I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but I'm told the language used, it's almost like an annihilation, a death. And then Eve is pulled from his side, not from the head, not from the feet, right? And then he says, you know, last bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. Well, I do tell the kids that that's a story and that's how it was read to me, and that's got to be the most awful way to ever say a story like that. I said, let's just pretend there's 10,000 species. I don't know. I mean, we know that this was an happening, but still a rhetorical device. So here's Adam who longs. Let me back up. I have a friend who used one of the online dating services. I can't think of the name, but it's one of the more popular ones. So I think he said he had 6 different profiles that matched up. Might have been how he talked about it. Went out, initial dates and such, and just nothing, very nice people, but nothing happened. And he talked about how disappointed he was each time. I mean, it had to knock something out of you. This is supposed to be some algorithm picking somebody for you based on mutual characteristics and likes and such. And you go out and you're both obviously are interested in a relationship and nothing there, and there's no hard feelings, and you don't want something to happen against its what's natural, but you walk out of there with your shoulders down a little bit. Well, okay, second time, the third time, the fourth time, 6 times. He'd given up almost. He had one point, and he said, and then one came up, and it was a lady over in Norriston, and he got on his cycle and started down the turnpike, and he said he turned around. He just said, I just don't have the emotional energy for this right now. I'm sure, what are they going to say? I'll just call them up, or however you do email. Didn't work out. But he said he turned around, but then something made him turn around and go again. And there's a good ending in that story. It worked out, and he's happily married today. But I think of, again, 6 times. So here's Adam. No, this isn't it for me. No, this isn't it for me. I can only imagine the experiences that this man was going through. So then, all of a sudden, this woman appears. He had to be head over heels in love. He had to be jumping up and down. He had to be running across the ground, lifting her up and saying, this is it. This is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. And then the two shall become one. So if we ever miss the connection, we are talking about marriage here. This is in the context, first of all, that Jesus was speaking about it, and also in the context that it was placed in Genesis. That's quite a beautiful thing. It's an understanding of how we fall in love, which I do talk to the kids about. How there's interior things that happen with us. And sometimes we can't wrap our minds around it. Sometimes love catches us quite by surprise. And all the physiology that surrounds this. So sometimes you see young people who are like falling in love, and they're giddy, and you're thinking, you're a lucky person. It's a great feeling. So we can only imagine how he felt with her. Now, it goes on to say that they were both naked without shame. So we're still here pre-fall, right? And what John Paul II would use is that they have this interior gaze. So it's a way for the woman and the man to look at each other and never objectify each other. They are total subjects before themselves. And now here's where something, and I don't mean it to sound a little sexist, but it could come across like that. Men don't understand what it means to be looked at in the eyes. A woman does. We're not in this state yet. So this gaze that they have for each other totally had to be in love. And it was bodily too. So this is where we get the theology of the body from. I just, my only hesitation through all this is that if we, in the end, reduce theology of the body down to simple sex, I think something's lost with it. But we could talk about that a little later. Okay, so then we all know they ate from the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. They crossed the boundary, all right? So now we're on a different side of things. Now we're entering this historical period, and they themselves recognize their own nakedness, and they wear fig leaves, which, I don't know if you saw it. Did you see it, Laura? This comic strip of Adam, Eve's over there eating a salad, said the salad's delicious. And Adam's like, put that down, Eve, that's my laundry, that type of thing. It was a funny cartoon. I sent it to Fathers Alone. I know he has that kind of humor. So, nonetheless, they themselves understood. Now, why did he not cover themselves with leaves? Because apparently, as we can understand, that there are aspects of the human person that are a little closer to expressing our identity than others, right? So they have to now protect themselves from being objectified by the other person. And then God himself, and you know the story from here, where are you? And I was naked. Well, who told you this? So he knew what happened, right? Rhetorical question. But he then fashioned aprons for them. So he recognizes things have changed now. Now, what's beautiful through all this is that we all know the proto-evangelium, right? The first good news. He turns to the serpent and says, a woman will come, her seed will crush, your seed will bite the ankles of the woman, and her seed will crush the head of the serpent. So we have this understanding that right away, God's going to plan to restore this, which is quite beautiful, and sometimes we miss that too. We don't, like, somebody might say, well, why was this so bad? Okay, I get they crossed the boundary, but how is it that all of this happened just because of that, what seems to be, not the most serious thing in the world? The best way from that, I answer my own questions, because I try to think, what is the difference? Well, I started, and here's how I explain it to the students. If two students hit each other, right? Okay, so you're going to get, depending on how bad it is, you're either just going to get detention or you can get ISS, so you can't hit each other. If one of the students strikes me, okay, now we're in deep trouble. Now, I'm no better than a student, but I am greater. If he goes down and hits Mr. Ballister, it's going to even increase from there, our principal. He's no better than me, but he is greater. If you go out and hit a police officer, he's no better, but he is greater. And if you try to be one of those screwballs that jumps the fence at the White House and do the 100-yard dash, President Obama is no better than the policeman, myself, you get it, but he is greater. So, offenses are always attached to the greatness of the authority. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, here we have an infinite greatness. So the slightest of all things then could be an infinite result. That may not solve it overall in our minds, but at least it helps us wrap our minds around why all this suffering because of that. Okay, so anyway, now you have them, so everything has changed, right? So now we're in desperate need of our grace. And I think this is where we then struggle, because this concupiscence, this ordered passions that we have are always at war with us. And we're going to have a tough time living out the vocation of man and woman from that point on. And we're going to have a more difficult time too trying to understand exactly how this reflects our Redeemer and our Trinitarian God. And if Satan has one goal, again, it's to destroy marriages, which when we look at marriage, maybe rather than just looking directly at theology of the body, I just want to talk maybe a little about the theology of marriage, and then if we have a discussion, we can do that. Sometimes we got to make sure we don't give the wrong impression with the understanding of the human person in marriage. Our goal with couples is not to divorce-proof them. We're not there to fire-proof them. We don't play defense like that. We want them to have a marriage, and this is what I typically would tell the engaged couples, that in 15 years, your neighbors are jealous in a good way, envious, I should say. How can two people possibly love each other that much? So when we talk about the understanding of the gift of the human person, one to the other, we're talking something very, very sacrificial. And I've often shared, and my wife doesn't take offense of it, that if anything were to happen to her, I would not get married again. And I'm not the perfect husband, but I can tell you it's exhausting. It's much easier to do what you want to do than it is to give entirely to the other person. So we struggle with this, and we wonder, what kind of witness do we give in our marriage? I mean, have we simply given marriage such a terrible name? It gets picked on in sitcoms, sure. But rather than simply saying we're going to find a way where you don't get divorced, how about that? How about in 15 years if your neighbors are just envious because they cannot imagine the life that you two have? I said, how about this? How about if your 30th year anniversary, your children literally lift a glass to you and just say, Mom, Dad, you set the bar too high. All of that is entirely possible. But we make constant decisions, right, in all our lives, and this just goes for any vocation, on how we push that forward. And we don't always choose well. Now, this is our historical state. Now John Paul II goes on to talk about an eschatological state, one that we would only see in heaven. So what is the purpose of marriage here on earth? Why is it only until death do we part? Because at death, it is now complete. We have done what we've done throughout death. So then what does the single, well, we can maybe say single, but what certainly does the religious life and the celibate life show? Well, the celibate life is no less sexual. It simply says, I'm giving a foretaste of heaven now. This is the relationship that we'll have. I'm giving that foretaste now. So it's almost like a sign of the eschatological state, and marriage is a sign of this is what is available through grace in this state. So it's quite a complementary way to understand it. But what's so important here is that without understanding of sexual differences, this doesn't quite work. And yes, it's an anatomical difference. We know that. Okay, so that part of the language of the body should be apparent to us, but it can't just be that. We'll talk a little bit more about this after the break with contraception, and we could bring it back in. But my view of a nuptial mystery is that what's very important is that we don't reduce it down to sex, and the reason why is because it's been my experience and almost the universal experience of every couple that I've asked is that the most intimate gift-giving times that they've had have not necessarily been conjugal love. So as important as that is, I think if we reduce it down to that, maybe it's easier to speak to a generation that's saturated with sex. Maybe that's part of what some people do, but I don't know that does a great service. There's a genuineness to the love relationship. My wife often says, I wish that somebody would have taught us this stuff when we were younger, but we didn't have it. And if you want to talk too about the differences between male and female, okay, so I have 2 different grad degrees focusing on the human person, and I've studied this quite extensively, and I like to come home and share with my wife what I've learned, and she usually looks at me like, yeah. In other words, it would have been a lot cheaper just to have her explain what it was rather than go and learn it somewhere. So, I mean, that's what I mean by intuitive. I think so, and I think this is a little easier sometimes, especially the second half of this, for women to hear. Not easier for women to hear, but I think they relate to it much easier. I think some of this men get drug into, and maybe that has to do with the culture. That might not be anything inherent in the human male, but it could be the culture. But nonetheless, this is the beauty of it, and this is what's at stake with marriage. So if we don't, Angelo Cardinal Scola used a term, it's a nice $5 term, but it makes sense. He called it, asymmetric reciprocity. In other words, there's always an asymmetry in a relationship, and on multiple levels. Now, you should be getting a little bit of the phenomenology of this, how it's really studying the experience and how the experience presents itself to us, right? Rather than studying, because rather than looking at it almost like in a lab, you can't really do that with phenomenology, which it makes it nice. It really fits like our experiential culture, but yeah, like I said, it can still retain the objectivity of truth. So you have this this lack of symmetry that's always between the other, but the way I understood it and the way I was taught was, when we were younger, I know you'd have like the 2 heart pendants. I'll have this half of the heart, and you have that half of the heart, and the 2 of us make one, the you complete me type thing. That doesn't really work with this. Yes, there's an asymmetry there, but they just don't fit together that neatly. There's always something there that's missing that only God can fill. And it's not just that he can fill, but that he's part of that. So, and not just part of that, but then there's also the openness, and this is what we'll have to talk later about, the openness to children. There's always has to be some way that perhaps that love can flow from that. So just as the Father loves the Son, and the Son receives all that love from the Father, and then returns it all back, and then the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, there's some of that goes on in our relationship, which maybe then we'll have a little bit of discussion. I like to end on Ephesians 5, because this, I know sometimes it's difficult at the pulpit for a pastor to preach this, especially when we're talking about wives, be submissive to your husbands. Well, I know when me and my wife were first married and she read through that, and I did, and she says, I don't think I like what I think that says. I said, one second. Hey guys, you have to go down here. We're having class. Go. Capisci? Yeah. That was nice.
You were very nice.
Basta, basta. There you go. Anyway, well, there was kids playing. I'd have done worse. Okay. Okay, so the Father gives himself to the Son. He withholds nothing. The Son even said, everything the Father has, he's given me. He's returning that now to the Father. He withholds nothing back. He returns it all. And then, from, I don't know how you want to explain it, aspiration, whatever, between the Father and the Son, in this total communal, ongoing love, then the Holy Spirit proceeds from that. Well, being submissive to the husband is not that bad when you understand that Christ is being submissive to his Father. There's no inequality that goes on here. It's a matter, and this is what I think, is difficult. And I like how John Paul II started out his pontificate, be not afraid. Because isn't that really what it comes down to? I don't want to give myself completely, because I'm opening myself up for hurt. Could I be mocked? May I not be loved in return? I know that I'd be worried about all these things. Sometimes we fight with this within ourselves, right? So, if we mimic that, and we have to be very careful here too, that the Trinity is it's not a model, okay? It's not just a motto that we have. This is a relational thing that we are basically taking on being in his image. So if the husband does give himself totally, everything I have, you give to your wife, you withhold nothing. Then she, in return, in total lack of fear, receives it all and returns it all. Now, yes, that's total submission, but this is such a beautiful thing that's going on between the two. There's no domination, which is always a fear, right? Because that's what happened here after the fall, that this dominating one over the other. And then always the openness to that, whether God is, offers the gift of life or not, or brings children into the family, however it might achieve. This is really what marriage is. And it never stops. Anybody who's married knows that. It really is exhausting. And you don't win every battle. I mean, nobody's perfect, right? So the takeaway then, although I hate using that word, is we have to understand, if we can always keep in mind that we are imaging the Trinity, and that's what's at stake, that we can diminish the imaging of the Trinity in the world, then when there are issues between a man and wife, we have to quickly realize that we are not each other's enemies. And this is on my mind all the time. And sometimes it still takes me days until it hits me. What does it take for Satan to get between a male and a female? Just make the man think that he's being used or made fun of. Make the woman think that she's being dominated. It doesn't take much to get in there, and then our psyche starts going off, and the next thing we know, this is our enemy. And then you stop and you think, oh, he's doing it again. He's trying to split the imaging that we do of the Trinity. Not going to let it happen. So then you resubmit yourself to the other person, and off he goes, just like the temptation in the desert. All of a sudden now, he leaves. It didn't work. That's really, I think, the struggle of this. And I think theology of the body, I don't think it's the sum of teaching. I think it's a contribution. We're still working through this, trying to understand how does all this, work out in the end. And I don't think John Paul II would ever have understood that this sort of like is the culmination, and now nothing further is needed. There's a lot of beauty there, and a lot of sublimity, and it's going to take a little bit of time to kind of unravel it and work through it, and I think that was his goal, and I think he's helping us in heaven now. So we got a few minutes. Anybody have anything to say on any of this? Or
I see marriage and the Eucharist being not a mirror image, but a parallel. I mean, that's what marriage is a total giving of one to the other. And so the Eucharist is the same thing, and so maybe we think of it like that, as the church being the bride and Christ being the bridegroom, And, you know, we always hear that Ephesians, and that we don't really think of it about what the husband or the groom is supposed to do, and that is just to, you know, give everything of himself, and not just be some dominant, you know, role in the relationship, and that wouldn't really be a relationship if it was the case. So
yeah, it's a good comparison. You'll see a lot of times in theology they'll speak of the Eucharist as a suprasexual. I mean, it's not sexual; it's above it all. So they'll call it a supersexual, you know, understanding of a relationship with God, and it's an intimate union. Yeah, so it is. It's quite beautiful. Anybody else?
I think, well, we use such sexist language in the church itself.
How is that?
Well, when we say God the Father, okay, and we don't adapt to the fact that God, and drop the father connotation, which is a male kind of term. The more we use that, the more we make it into a gender, and we get an image of a male. And that's a very real thing that goes on for us. God is spirit. Either
Well, then
male
how do
or
we? But we
female.
do understand that it was revealed that way, though. I mean, we can't dismiss the revelation.
Well, I think we need to be aware in our day and age. Sure, there was an intimacy between Jesus and the Father, but I think that God, the Creator, okay, is in another space, in another place in our relationship, and it's not always to a male figure. The other issue is we have in you know, women be submissive to your wife, be submissive to your husband. That was the context of that time, which Paul wrote that. You know, women had to be submissive. You know, and that's how he wrote it. So that we have to think of when things were written in the time they were written, and the emphasis that were put to it in the reading of it. The other reality is, I think, there was a wonderful program on Being on Sunday, where they had a...
On what, sister?
It's on Being.org, I guess. It's on NPR. You can pick it up anytime when you're... But anyway, she was an anthropologist and a philosopher, and just the reality of the length of our lives. Back in the time, history, got married when you were 14, you lived for 7 years in a marriage, and your life was short, you would die, right? But as time went on, when you got married, the length of the years in which we live is like tripled, you know? So that you're going through many lifetimes with one partner, as it was back in history. That's a major transition for us, I think, to really grapple with. And a point that she made I thought was really good is over a lifetime, and I think this is what's significant in any relationship that's long lasting. Like good friends, my good friend from grade school to this day and age in my life, or a marriage that goes on for 50 years, goes through so many changes. And like these changes would be like the sexual attraction when you're a younger person. Then you give into the next phase, which is children. And then the next phase is where you are just with each other. And in that all is all those changes that go on, where the communication about what I want to do now, what I want to experience now, and part of you think, gee, you're absolutely crazy for thinking you want to go that. We have all these other things we have to do. That's where you have to grapple with, I think, negotiating with each other what can be done. The same way in my life as a religious, you know, I'm not in this by myself. I'm in with a community, you know, and your community could be the intimacy of your family, and then maybe just your extended family a little bit. I got thousands when I look at the bigger picture. But we're all these small communities, and we keep on grappling, but we learn it between these certain relationships where there's either 2 or 3 good friends for a long period of time, or a marriage relationship where you're committed to each other. But this is something we've evolved into as a human being, to live this long and these long commitments. So therefore, it takes a lot more to really deal with it. So, and I think it's beautiful. I mean, I do believe that's where we get our energy and our faith, is that dynamic in the Trinity, because we're caught up in that learning of that communication, and a level of giving. But
you have different understandings of love. You know, I don't ever want to, when I'm talking to young men and women, young students, I love each other. But I don't ever diminish that, because it's something real. But it's I share my own experience. You know, when I met my wife, I had one of those moments where I really did think I was going to marry her. I mean, I don't know where it came from, but I had that. When I was engaged, I thought, oh, how can you love this person any more than this? Well, when I was married, how can I love her any more than this day? I remember different little hallmarks, like the 3rd year. Oh my God, I love her so much more than I did then. 10th year, 20th, 25th year. Well, you know, I was friends with a young guy whose grandparents were married 76 years, and they died 2 weeks apart. He was 100, she was 93, and they were both in hospital gurneys in the downstairs of their living room, with just enough space between them for an attendant to go in between, and they were holding hands when I went to visit them. And I'm sure that if I were able to go back and talk to them and say, hey, now I'm married 25 years, and they said, yeah, I thought I couldn't love her anymore at that point too. So, you know, you're right, there's this evolution that we go through as love. And, you know, in which we haven't talked, and we don't need to go in here talking about the homosexual person, which you always talk in terms of personhood. When I, you know, talk about homosexuality, or somebody brings up the homosexual person, you know, I have no problem talking, I'm going to say respectfully and, you know, sensibly about it. But I often get the pushback, why don't you worry about heterosexuals? Why do you always have to, this is an accusation against the church to throw, why do you always have to bring up homosexuality? And I said, you know, quite frankly, you know, when I give talks on homosexuality, it's 2.5 hours, maybe 2 sentences goes to the homosexual person. I said, I don't think it's a fair critique, so if you're seeing it somewhere, you know, talk to that person. But that being said, there's one sexuality, one morality. There's not 2 moralities, one for them, one for us. You know, and even with the students, I will share, and maybe this will be a good just way to end until we have a little break, that I have this letter from a man who is homosexual, and he's married with 3 children. He says he's not attracted to women. He's not even necessarily sexually attracted to his wife, but he loves her, and quite possibly on a deeper level than most heterosexuals love their wives. And he says, I think you're getting confused when I identify myself as a homosexual, and he's still attracted to men, but yet married. He says, I have the same struggle all other males have. I'm attracted to somebody who's not my wife. Don't all couples have that? Yes. So I tell the students that. If you somehow think that you're going to get married, and you get to have sex, that'll satisfy you, and your eyes will never wander, you're setting yourself up for a certain failure. It's always a matter of, I have chosen this one, and all others I have not chosen. So you'll never stop being sexually attracted to those that you were before you were married. You, through chastity, learn to integrate that. Just as if, you know, the religious, you know, being a priest or nun doesn't mean you don't get to have sex with anybody. You only are giving up one person, not 2, 3, 4, 5. It's a different understanding of it, and you know, it's something that goes a little bit deeper. But that, I think, was a beautiful letter, and if I would have thought about it, maybe I could have found it for tonight. But he says, I'm trying my best through struggles to live out my imaging of God in the life that I have. Now, he says not everybody needs to choose to get married. He says, but I did fall in love with this woman just on a slightly different level than most men. It was kind of a beautiful letter and very, straightforward, but nonetheless, you want to just take 5 minutes or so here? I can go yell at the kids again?
Go crush them in hopes and dreams.
You must work here?
Yes, the SS Spirit Sucker.